Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started with the next section. We are going to be talking about alignment for your entire dissertation. And this is one of the trickiest but most important parts of your entire dissertation process. Can somebody let me know if you can see the slide? Yeah, okay, great,
Yes.
thanks. Thanks, Mike. Um, So when we talk about alignment, we are talking about everything that you do with your dissertation has to be connected to all of the key components of the dissertation. And so you can't just start with with what you think you're going to find and try to connect it afterwards. There's a specific process that you need to follow. And as Dr. Warren said earlier, you've got to trust that process. You're going to hear it from all of us. It doesn't matter which advisor you are working with, we're all going to say exactly the same thing. Follow the process, and you will have a wonderful end result. If you don't follow the process, you're going to get stuck somewhere in the entirety of your dissertation. So this whole presentation is really going to just talk you through how do I connect and understand the each element of the dissertation and make sure that it's connected to what I'm actually studying. So this is the first slide that we have here. This is something that I wish somebody would have shown me early on in my dissertation process. My process was substantially different from this one, and we didn't have advisors until we were done writing. And so you wrote everything up, and then all of a sudden you were working with an advisor who was going to tell you how everything was broken. And that is the worst way to do it because you don't know if it's connected and aligned properly at the beginning of your dissertation process. So you're making a lot of mistakes and then going back and fixing them. Our process is designed to start with the alignment right out of the gate. So the slide that you're seeing on the screen now is what we call the 10-minute article review. And if somebody had shown me this early on in my doctoral studies period, let alone during the dissertation, I think I would have been a much smarter reader and for sure a much better researcher. So basically what this is about is that before you even start your dissertation writing, you should make sure that you have references and resources that you understand and organize them in a way, find them in a way that makes sense. And so we call that the quick review. And I think one of the things that it needs to start with is your understanding of what you're even looking for. When you first start your research, you're going to be all over the place. You think your topic is X, but while you're looking for information on X, you're going to find Y and Z and all these other things, and you're not quite sure what to do with all of that information. So here's an easy guide to take a look at how do you quickly review a study or an article and know if it's relevant to yours. And so I started with this instead of starting with the alignment because you're going to be starting this data collection in terms of the literature relatively early. And if you know how to organize it and look for it, it's going to be easier for you. So the quick review, you should be looking at a couple of things that are really important without reading the entire study. So what we recommend is that you find your reference, and that's all going to be dependent on the keyword searches that you do. And then once you've found your references, you take a look at the abstract to see if it's even in line anywhere with what you're trying to study. And then you take a look at the methodology that they used and the methods. So I'm going to talk in a little bit about the difference between methodology and methods. But if you don't look at least those three things, the abstract, the methodology, and the methods, you're going to be pulling studies that may have nothing to do with yours, and it's going to start derailing you. You're going to see a shiny object that you want to go look at instead because that sounds cooler and more fun, and you're going to get completely derailed from your original focus. So if you take a look at this chart here, it has three different references, and it talks about their different methodologies and their different methods. So what's the difference then between methods and methodology and what is alignment? That's what this session is all about. We're going to talk about the difference between methodology, research design, and methods. And then we're going to talk about the alignment as it relates to developing your research in its entirety. And then finally, we'll close out with, okay, how do I keep it all aligned and make sure it results in this dissertation that I can defend and actually use in the future for other things? So let's talk a little bit about what methodology is. And the slide doesn't say this, but methodology is the underlying principle and rationale for your entire study. It's the framework for understanding and choosing appropriate methods. So the methodology is the framework. The research design outlines the structure and plan for your study, and it ensures that the research questions are addressed. And then finally, the methods are just the specific techniques that are part of your research design and methodology. So is it surveys or focus groups or interviews? So that's the difference between the methodology, methods, and research design. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and I'll answer them, or I will do questions at the end as well. So one of the things you want to start with is your problem. Every advisee I work with might have a rough idea of what their problem's going to be, but they've already started collecting literature and doing their own research. That's really hard to do if you haven't clearly defined your problem. And so as you begin to work on your dissertation, the thing that I would do first and make sure you have nailed down is your problem and your purpose statement. And Dr. Bilodeau will be covering that in not only here, but in the dissertation essentials. And so make sure you understand where these two folders are. There's the summit and there's the essentials. The essentials has a lot of really good information on the different sections of your dissertation. The summit kind of ties it all together. And so really focusing on defining your problem and your purpose is going to be your first step. Don't start anywhere else. Our gut reaction or inclination is to jump into methodology right away. You can't do that unless you clearly understand what your problem is. So if you think you want to study turnover, that's great. That's the problem. But what is the purpose of your study? Well, the purpose is going to be dependent upon how you have framed what you would like to research. And so you can't really start without your purpose and your problem. You'll just start collecting so much information, you won't know what to do with it. That's where the alignment comes in. It is so important that you align absolutely everything you do with your problem and your purpose. So if those aren't clear, you're going to start grabbing stuff that isn't going to make sense. And then the other huge piece of all of this is that every step along the way, you need to make sure that you talk to your advisors to make sure that you're headed in the right direction. So don't do huge chunks of work without checking in with your advisor. If you have defined your purpose and problem, make sure they help you understand if that is going to align with your actual research. Don't just define your purpose and problem and then start working. Make sure you've met with your advisor to make sure that that is going to give you a strong alignment. So stay connected to your advisor and your major advisor, which sometimes we call chair, and make sure that you are working with them along the way throughout the entire process. This is a crazy chart that kind of talks about the whole flow and how you can get in your way along the way. In other words, how you can derail your own study. Stay away from derailing your own study by making sure that you understand that there is a difference in purpose and scope. So you need to make sure that you understand what you're working on by having defined the purpose and how you're working on it by following the scope and the alignment. So there's 3 different kinds of research. Over here on the right, you see that there's basic or applied research, EBP, and QI. I'll tell you what those are because that understanding will help you understand or at least start working on after you've defined your purpose and your problem, which direction you want to go in. So basic or applied research really just seeks to expand the fundamental knowledge that's already there to solve a practical problem. So it's just very basic and you're applying it to a problem. When you start working on evidence-based research, you're really looking at and applying the best clinical evidence to making a decision or solving a problem. So if you're doing research on turnover, for example, I'll just keep using that same example, that you're going to look at all the stuff that's already out there, the evidence that's already talking about things that relate to turnover. Are people turning over because of leadership or lack of training or compensation or all of those things? You're going to look at evidence to apply that to your study. So that's evidence or EBP. And then QI is quality improvement. Maybe you're seeking to improve something. You have a process that you have decided just really needs to be approved or improved. Then you want to start looking at the process to improve, or the systematic approach that you're going to take to improve that process. So those are kind of three different ways that you can look at a problem that you're trying to solve, and that could help you define how you're going to do your research. So you want to make sure that you know and understand the whole cycle by knowing, first of all, what your problem is, maybe taking a look at some of the evidence or historical theories or other studies, and then making sure that you construct and revise how you're going to approach your research to begin with. The other key things that you need to be aware of is the difference between meta-analysis and a systematic review. Meta-analysis helps you predict the direction and the how big the connection of relationships between your study variables are. So with meta-analysis, you're going to combine the results of multiple studies within a systemic review and come up with a summary of how those are connected. And so that's kind of a quantitative approach. It's not kind of, it is a quantitative approach to your research. A systemic review is a comprehensive and unbiased, that's important, synthesis of all of the available evidence on a specific research question. So what systemic review will do will help you identify, analyze and appraise and synthesize all of the relevant information that's out there. The meta-analysis will help you quantify that. So when you start thinking about your research, you have different ways that you can do the research, the three types of research I talked about on the last slide, and then different ways for how you can understand how to review what's already out there. So I'm going to give you an example of how you could connect the theory. So you've come up with some theories that you want to study to your actual research. And I'm going to use the theory of planned behavior. That's the TBB that's up there, PB. Basically what that is I'm taking the theory of planned behavior and I'm going to hypothesize about some things that might help me apply that theory. So in this particular example, my first hypothesis is that skepticism reduces attitudes towards cause-brand alliances and purchase intentions. So if I'm connecting the theory, I'm saying that this theory applies to what I'm trying to study. And what I'm trying to study in this example is the theory of planned behavior. I'm trying to understand how I can look at behavior, which is the purchase intention, based on that TBP theory. So you're not going to remember all of this. As you go through starting to work on your dissertation, these slides will be available to you in the folder so that you can go back and refer to them as you're working on each one of the sections. It will help you stay focused on what you need. Okay? Again, in alignment with your problem and purpose, and always talking with your advisor. Okay, so this slide is important because you're going to get confused, I promise you, because there is a difference between method and methodology. A method is just a tool to answer your research questions. It's sort of how you're going to collect your data. So are you going to interview, going to survey? How are you going to do this? Focus groups, wrap sessions, and it's a level of measurement. So it takes a look at how you're going to collect the data that you're going to use for your study. The methodology is all encompassing. It is the big picture. It's the rationale for how you're going to approach your research and what lens you're going to use to look at it. And so the methodology is everything. The method is just one of the tools that you will use. And as you're working on your methodologies, they can include a bunch of different kinds of methodologies. There's quantitative and qualitative. There's mixed methods. There's different kinds of qualitative and different kinds of quantitative. And with qualitative, it's really more descriptive. You're going to be looking at causal or comparative relationships. You're going to be looking for correlations, whereas quantitative assigns a value to something. So it might be anything from a phenomenological study to a really grounded theory that you're taking a look at based on the numerical data that you get. So just because you might be using quantitative and qualitative together that doesn't necessarily mean it is a mixed method study. So in other words, if you just do a survey with an open response, that doesn't necessarily make it a mixed methods right away. Okay, there's a way to connect qualitative and quantitative that will make a truly mixed method study. And I'll tell you what we tell students all the time. Many students want to come in and do qualitative and only qualitative because they think it's easier. I will tell you that most studies probably should have an integrative approach using qualitative and quantitative because the study will be more effective. And it's not necessarily easier to do a qualitative study. It's actually more challenging. It's going to take longer, more time. But a good qualitative or quantitative foundation can help you do a great mixed method study that will make your study more valuable, not just to you, but to industry. And ultimately, the reason we're doing this research is to solve a problem. So if we're taking a look through a mixed methods approach, we're generally getting more information that's going to help us solve that problem. So don't be afraid of quantitative, please, because if you're afraid of quantitative, you might cheat yourself out of a great opportunity to really learn deeply about the problem you're trying to solve. So one of the things that this slide talks about is Cresswell. Well, Cresswell is an amazing resource for you to use, because if you want to do a mixed method study or you are not quite sure, starting with understanding what Cresswell is saying will help you understand where you want to go from here. And we use Cresswell very heavily in terms of helping students understand, what does this all even mean? What do I need to connect? How do I need to collect stuff? Do I want to do quant or qual or both, or maybe a little bit of each? And maybe I'm going to use my qualitative or my quantitative to show a connection and the qualitative to show why there's a connection. So Cresswell is a great place to start. So I highly recommend that you pull that resource early and you use it as much as you possibly can as you're defining your entire study, as you're designing your research. Okay. The research design is, as I mentioned earlier, how are you approaching the entire research study? And it helps you outline the structure or your plan for your entire study. There is elegance in simplicity. So the more simple you can keep your study, the more focused you can stay on actually solving the problem. So what you're going to try to do as you're creating your research design is make some really important decisions about some of the things that you do within your research. So these are some bullet points that can help you frame that research design in a way that will keep you focused on the problem. So what are you trying to accomplish? Your overall aims and approach should be a huge part of your research design. You don't necessarily know what the answer is going to be, because that would make your study biased as you're designing this, but you do want to know what you're trying to get out of the study. So generally speaking, it's solving the problem, or at least understanding the problem so that you can better address the steps to try to at least mitigate or solve that problem. The research design also helps you understand what you're going to do, the actual what of behind your study. It'll help you understand how you'll select the participants and the subjects. A lot of you want to jump right into your methodology before you've clearly framed your problem. And so if you don't really focus on your research design, you're going to start doing things all over the place, and you won't stay focused on collecting the right data from the right people, okay, or the right places. The other thing the research design will help you do is understand your data collection methods. It will, if you design your research well enough based on your research questions, you won't go looking for data that does not relate to your study. And so a good solid research design will help you understand the process and procedures to collect your data and then to analyze it. So the research design helps you understand and relate everything back to the purpose and the problem. It helps you frame how you're going to do the study itself, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or mixed. It's going to help you really plan and stay focused on how you collect the data, which is your method. And then you're going to use your design to help you frame how you're going to analyze what you get once you've gotten it. So a solid research design really helps your study just flow along as it's supposed to. Okay. So let's talk about the whole alignment piece. To me, this is the most important part of your research design, making sure that you keep everything aligned back to all of the aspects of your study. So a research study that is in alignment across all of those aspects, and the aspects are your research question, your hypothesis, the methodology, the design, and the actual field of study that you're in. If you keep the alignment across all of those, Lovett says that it is a great and wonderful display in the field and executed competently and confidently, which is really important. So it results in a study that's worth something. It's valuable. If you don't keep it aligned, it's not going to make sense. And honestly, if there's not an alignment, you're not going to be able to write the thing. You could probably go out and collect the data, but it's going to be very challenging for you to write your final manuscript if it's not aligned across all of these elements, because they won't stay connected. They won't make sense. So that lack of alignment is quite probably the thing that we see the most in terms of not being successful with your defense. So you want to make sure that you're staying aligned across all of those elements as you're working on your study. And so we're going to help you do that. Your advisor is going to help make sure that from the very beginning of when they're working with you at that problem statement and the purpose of your study, you keep your alignment across the whole thing. And this is what alignment looks like. These are those elements I talked about: your problem or your purpose, and then your research questions that come from that problem or purpose, and then the hypothesis or the guesses that you've made along the way, and then the methodology, so sort of the structure of your study, all relates back to the research design and the methods that you use. If there's a break in any of these things, you are not going to be able to write your final study. So let me give you an example of what a good alignment looks like. So I'm just going to give you some sample. I have two good ones and one bad one. So this first one is a good one. It's effective. So we're studying burnout, and our problem is that burnout is a problem for retaining remote workers. So we've gotten very, very specific. We have honed down on that problem. We aren't just talking about burnout. If you try to just talk about burnout in general, there is going to be so much stuff. You're not going to be able to keep it aligned with everything else that you're working on as part of your research design. So we are going to hone in on, this is our problem. Burnout is a problem for retaining remote workers. And so then we are going to go to our research questions, which is that second box, our second rectangle. Do leaders affect workers' turnout intentions? So we have decided we're working on the problem of burnout with remote workers. And one of the things we want to research is the leadership impact. Does it impact, do leaders impact turnover intentions? That's going to help us stay aligned. That one research question will help us stay aligned with the burnout problem with remote workers. The next box or rectangle is the hypothesis. I've hypothesized that leaders experience lower levels of burnout. Followers of leaders who experience lower levels of burnout do or don't have an impact on turnover. Okay, so do you see how that's all connected? So if I'm studying remote worker burnout, and then I'm also studying leaders more specifically and their impact on how followers feel about the lower levels or burnout, then I can come up with a study that makes more sense because it's aligned with what I'm trying to solve. And in this particular case, they went with a quantitative, quasi-experimental approach. And then they tied that all back to the initial problem and the research questions. The last two rectangles are the research design and methods. Those are very closely tied to that original problem. So we're going to do a pre and post test. We're going to take two groups and compare them, and then do an ANOVA to make sure that burnout and intentions to quit aren't impacted by other things. It's all connected and aligned. If we don't do this alignment, we're going to come up with a bunch of wonky information that we can't tie together. And then therefore, all the data we collected isn't going to make sense, and I can't write about it. I can't tell the story. So this alignment is going to tell your story of the research that you did. So students often ask me, what if I have the right problem and the right research questions, but they don't say what I thought my hypothesis was going to, they don't say what I thought it was going to say. That's totally okay. because you're then going to explain what that means. It's part of the story. However, if you don't keep all of this as part of your story, you don't have an end of your story that you're going to be able to talk about. So that's why the alignment is so important. The other thing that I want to show you in this next example is that alignment is great, but sometimes you don't have an hypothesis going in. So in this particular example, you have the problem of there are too few women pursuing careers in operations. That actually happens to be true. And this is a study that one of our earlier students did. So the problem is there's too few women who pursue careers in operations. And we're not going to talk about why that's a problem, but we have already decided that that's a problem. And that's what we want to study. And that's where we want to collect some data and information on so we can talk about how we're going to intervene with that or solve that problem. The next rectangle is the research question. Are women nurtured to avoid quantitative work? That is something that we found in the literature review that said, ooh, we're starting to see that the reason behind fewer women in operations is because when they're younger, K through 12, they aren't encouraged to go into this kind of work. Okay. So if that's the case, that is connected to the problem, we can then move into doing the study. And in this particular example, they decided to go with a qualitative phenomenological study, which was rooted in the original problem because they wanted to figure out, the qualitative piece was figuring out why. Why are so few women going in? And more importantly, for this particular research question that's tied to the original problem, why are they avoiding it? Is it really because they aren't nurtured into that career field, or is it something else? And that helps us drive the research design, which is the focus group that is going to help us inform and script the interviews that we're going to do later. And then also the methods, which is we're going to analyze the content of the focus groups to help us come up with the interviews that we're going to do after that. Okay. I'm not going to cover the next alignment because that's a good one. I'm going to cover the misalignment example. So here, it's almost obvious. You can see it right away how it's not aligned, but I want to walk you through it. If it's not aligned, it's typically because we have an okay problem, but everything else we do after that isn't aligned to that problem. So we've decided that study abroad students develop a global mindset. That's not necessarily a problem, but it's something that we want to prove or disprove, right? So we're going to do study abroad programs, and we believe that we are going to see students develop a much stronger global mindset because they're studying abroad. But look at that next section, which is, if you remember, that next section is your research question. The first research question that this particular bad example came up with was that, do students who travel change in their global perspective? What does travel have to do with studying abroad? See that disconnect? There isn't a connection there. If our research question was clear and it was tied to studying abroad and not travel, there would be a big difference. So if you miss the alignment in that very first step in that research question, nothing else is going to be aligned. Your hypothesis isn't going to make sense. You're not going to pick the right research design or methodology. You're going to have a problem with even writing this thing up because you're going to get this data and it's going to say that, yeah, there may be some improvement in global perspective with travel, but that's not answering that's not aligned with what you're actually studying. You want to know about study abroad programs. And so your misalignment has completely screwed up the whole rest of your research. And that's why it's so important. Here's another example of a bad alignment. Women are not represented in the C-suite. Well, if we use a lot of guesses, we're all going to say, yeah, there's not enough women in the C-suite or in senior executive positions. But that very first box, why don't successful women support the development of others? What does that have to do with the C-suite? So I'm hoping that you can see that alignment can be messed up anywhere along the way. You could still have a great research question, but then your hypothesis, or even worse, your methodology and research design don't support solving that problem or answering that question. That's why this alignment is so important. So the big takeaways from this part of the presentation are, don't start with your methodology. All of you want to say, I want to do qualitative. Who cares what you want to do at this point? what you really want to do is start with the problem that you're trying to solve or the question that you're trying to answer. And so if you start with, I want to do qualitative, you're missing out on framing that problem appropriately. That is why during your prospectus and your proposal phase, you're spending so much time on that. Students sometimes get frustrated about spending that time, but that is the foundation of your complete alignment. And if you do not do that work and you don't stay solid in that, you're going to have a huge issue with making sure that you have an opportunity to really understand that whole connectivity along the whole process. Okay. The other thing is that alignment can't stop. Even after you started collecting data, if you find something that you've misaligned, you have to readdress that. It starts with the planning, though. Just like anything else we do as leaders, you have to plan. You have to have a strategy. If something breaks, you go back to the strategy, and that's why the alignment is so important. And the most important thing about this entire dissertation is that you stay connected with your advisors all along the way and recognize that I would say, at least for myself and maybe some of the other faculty members on here will say the same thing, 99.9% sure they will, that we absolutely love to see the growth through a study because it benefits the knowledge and the field of in the industry that we're working in. We love research. We nerd out on research. And so the fact that we're available to you should be taken advantage of. You should use the connection to your advisor all along the way. So don't dive into something and start working on it if you haven't connected with your advisor yet. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to see if you have any questions at this point. I don't see anything in the chat. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I want to show you one other thing in the dissertation essentials since no one has a question yet at this point. I'm going to share one more time. I'm going to go back to showing you one other section in here that we're not covering today, but I think it's really important to know where it's at. You're probably not going to remember where it's at, but at least you know it's in here. And that is the section about building your instrument. Not every single one of you is going to be using an instrument, but I want you to know where to find the information if you should decide to do a survey or a questionnaire. So if you go all the way down, all of the folders for each one of these is under the Dissertation Summit, and each one of these sections is found in the Dissertation Summit folder. Right under My Methodology and Alignment, which is where you will find the PowerPoint and the recording, is this section called Instrument Selection and Assembly. In there, you will find a lot of key information around, okay, yeah, I've decided to do, because it's aligned and it makes sense, I've decided to do a survey or a questionnaire. In here is where you're going to find information about how to do that, okay? So in your Dissertation Summit folder, all of these presentations that you're seeing today can be found there. And in addition to that, that one section that I did not cover that your advisor will refer you back to as you decide how to work through your survey instrument. Anything else any of the other DBA faculty want to add, or any questions?
I would just say, first of all, thank you. I wish I had had this information when I was writing my dissertation. This is not common. And also for the students, this isn't a hobby. Your academic advisors, your major advisors know this stuff backwards and forward. You need to listen to them. You need to follow the plan. If you, especially with the alignment piece, if you start rolling off the cliff because you've misaligned your dissertation path, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So by all means, ask and listen to the answer your major advisor gives you.
Let me just add to that. I think this is really important to appreciate, embrace, and understand. Your advisor is not your friend, and they're not judging you. They're interested in your research. They have a passion about what you're studying. And you need to trust that when you get off of a Zoom session with them, they're not going to go tell all the other faculty members, oh my gosh, this was ridiculous. Do not be embarrassed, timid, or shy. They are a resource, and they're learning from you too. I can tell you that all of the committees that I've sat on, even outside of Johnson & Wales, have been such a phenomenal learning opportunity for me, and they will be for you too. So we're going to learn with you and grow with you. So don't be embarrassed about asking us questions. I had a student before say, I wasn't sure if I should ask that. If you're not sure, ask, because if you're not sure, it means it should be asked. And nothing is going to happen if you ask a question that, I mean, we don't think questions are silly. It helps us all develop. So please don't hesitate to work with your advisor on every phase. And if you fall off the apple cart, so to speak, and get derailed, it's okay. We'll help you get back on as long as you're communicating with us. We'll help you with that alignment and any other problems that come up as long as you're communicating with us.
That was awesome. Thank you. All right, if there aren't any questions, we will take a bio break. This will be a 10-minute break, the only 10-minute break in this session today. We will return promptly at 10:45 for Dr. Schofstall.
Don't forget to stop the recording.